What if some of the greatest civilizations in human history were never mentioned in your textbooks? Not because they weren't important, not because they didn't build wonders, but because history, as we're taught it, often leaves entire worlds behind. Tonight, we're uncovering lost civilizations you didn't learn in school, powerful societies that rose, thrived, and vanished, leaving behind mysteries carved in stone, buried beneath jungles, or hidden under desert sands. We're talking about the advanced city of Great Zimbabwe, whose massive stone walls still puzzle historians, the vast trade networks of Cahokia, once larger than medieval London, the desert marvel of Petra, carved directly into rose-red cliffs, and the ancient metropolis of Caral, built thousands of years before the pyramids of Egypt. These weren't minor footnotes. They were centers of innovation, culture, engineering, and power, yet somehow, many of us never heard their names in school. In this video, we'll explore how these civilizations rose to greatness, the technologies and ideas that made them extraordinary, the mysteries surrounding their decline, and why their stories matter today. If you love hidden history, forgotten empires, and the thrill of discovering what's been overlooked, you're in exactly the right place. Before we dive in, take a second to like this video. It helps more curious minds find these untold stories. Comment below if there's a lost civilization you've always been fascinated by. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a journey into the past. When this episode ends, be sure to check out our related videos. There are even more forgotten worlds waiting to be uncovered. Now, let's step beyond the pages of the textbook and rediscover the civilization's history almost forgot. The Indus Valley civilization to 6001-900 BCE. There is a city sleeping under dust in modern-day Pakistan. Its streets are straight, its bricks are even. Its drains are better planned than some modern suburbs. This is Mohenjo-Daro, and it is older than most of the history you learned in school. Tonight, we walk slowly through it. Picture the Indus River 4,000 years ago. Wide, slow, brown with silt. It floods gently, leaves rich soil behind. Farmers plant wheat and barley. Cattle move through fields. The air smells like wet earth and smoke. And rising from that river plain, not a temple city, not a pyramid complex, but a grid. Perfect lines, north to south, east to west. The streets are laid out like someone had a ruler and a plan. This was not random growth. This was design. The people of the Indus Valley civilization built cities that feel calm, orderly, practical, not obsessed with kings. We do not find giant statues of rulers here. No colossal ego carved in stone. No tombs stuffed with gold for one man's afterlife. Instead, we find houses, blocks of houses, with bathrooms. Yes, bathrooms. Each home had access to a drainage system. Wastewater ran through covered brick channels beneath the streets. The drains had inspection holes for cleaning. Some even had settling tanks. Imagine explaining to someone in 2600 BCE that in the future, many cities would forget how to manage sewage properly. They might laugh, or they might politely offer you a brick, because their bricks were standardized, almost perfectly proportioned. The same ratio across cities hundreds of miles apart. That means regulation, shared systems, agreement. It suggests something powerful, coordination without visible tyranny. No carved faces of emperors watching from above, just infrastructure. And infrastructure is not glamorous. It does not shout. It whispers competence. Another major site, Harappa, tells the same story. Wide streets, brick platforms, warehouses, wells, so many wells. Water was everywhere in these cities. Private wells, public wells. People did not have to walk miles for it. It was part of daily life, accessible, designed. At the center of Mohenjo-Daro stands something unusual, a structure we call the Great Bath. It is not massive like a pyramid. It is not tall, but it is carefully built, waterproofed with bitumen, surrounded by rooms, stairs descending into a deep rectangular pool. We are not sure what it was for. Ritual bathing, ceremony, community gathering. Whatever the purpose, it suggests something important. Cleanliness, water, ritual, order, not conquest, not spectacle. Now here is where things get mysterious. We have thousands of small seals, little carved squares of stone. They show animals, bulls, elephants, strange horned creatures, and above them, symbols, a script, still undeciphered. 4,000 years later, we cannot read their words. Imagine that, a whole civilization speaking to us through symbols, and we just stare back. Scholars have tried everything. Linguistic comparisons, statistical analysis, AI models, still no clear answer. Were they writing names, trade goods, prayers, jokes? We do not know, which is humbling, because history feels solid when you can read it. When you have kings and wars and dates carved clearly into rock. Here, we have silence. And yet, trade networks suggest this was no isolated culture. Indus seals have been found in Mesopotamia. They traded beads, cotton textiles, maybe even spices. Boats likely moved along rivers and coastlines. Ox carts rolled over dusty paths linking cities. This was a connected world, not primitive, not waiting for real civilization to arrive. It was already there. One of the strangest things about the Indus Valley civilization is what we do not see. No clear palaces, no massive royal tombs, no art glorifying warfare. That does not mean there was no hierarchy. Every society has structure, but if there were kings, they were modest, or invisible, or expressed power differently. Archaeologists have found very few weapons, no grand depictions of battles. It is possible, just possible, that this civilization emphasized order over domination, trade over conquest, standardization over spectacle. Imagine that being your legacy. Not he conquered, but they built drains that still work. There is something deeply soothing about that. And then, around 1900 BCE, the cities begin to empty, not in flames, not with dramatic destruction layers. They thin out. Streets are used less. Maintenance declines. Some neighborhoods are abandoned. Why? Climate change is one theory. The Indus River system may have shifted. Monsoon patterns may have weakened. Trade routes may have fractured. Or maybe a combination of slow pressures, environmental stress, economic shifts. Civilizations do not always fall like dominoes. Sometimes they just unravel quietly. People migrate, adapt, move east, change livelihoods. The great grid cities fade. Brick by brick, they are swallowed by earth. For centuries, they are forgotten. Villagers in the 1800s use ancient bricks for railway construction, unaware they are dismantling a Bronze Age metropolis. The city becomes a rumor beneath their feet, until archaeologists begin digging, and the past rises again. There is a strange comfort in this story, a civilization that built carefully, lived densely, managed water wisely, spoke in symbols we cannot read, and left no towering statue demanding worship. It challenges the idea that greatness must be loud, that power must be carved large, that history must revolve around a single name. Here, the greatness is collective, anonymous, systematic. It feels almost modern. And maybe that is why Mohenjo-Daro feels so haunting. It looks like a city waiting for its people to return from work, as if someone just stepped out for bread 4,000 years ago. Tonight, as we leave the streets of the Indus, notice the silence. No battle cries, no coronation speeches, just wind brushing against old brick. Civilization without visible tyranny, order without spectacle, a culture that may have valued balance more than glory. And though we cannot read their script, their layout still speaks. Straight lines, careful drains, shared wells. Sometimes the most advanced thing a society can do is make daily life easier, and then disappear without demanding applause. The earth covered their cities, but it did not erase them. It waited. And now, under quiet stars, we remember, slowly, gently, like uncovering brick after brick. The Minoans, 2001-450 BCE. There is an island in the middle of the Mediterranean where the light feels different, bright, sharp, almost theatrical. This is Crete, and long before classical Greece, before Rome, before the stories you memorized in school, there was a civilization here that ruled the sea. Its heart was Knossos, but it did not look like a war fortress. It looked like a maze. Imagine approaching Knossos at dawn. No massive defensive walls greet you, no towering battlements. Instead, a sprawling palace complex, open courtyards, painted columns tapering downward, rooms layered upon rooms. It feels less like a castle and more like a living organism. Hallways twist, staircases double back, light wells bring sunlight deep inside the structure. Air moves through carefully designed spaces. If you have ever gotten lost in a shopping mall, you have had a mild Minoan experience. The Greeks later told stories of a labyrinth here, of a monster called the Minotaur, of a hero navigating endless corridors. Myth grows where memory blurs, and sometimes myth is a shadow cast by something real. The Minoans were sailors. Their ships moved between islands, across open water, trading pottery, saffron, olive oil, and finely crafted goods. They connected Egypt, the Near East, and mainland Greece in a web of commerce, and their art tells us something important. It is joyful. Walls are covered in frescoes, dolphins leaping, blue monkeys climbing rocks, young men and women vaulting over bulls in acrobatic ritual. No grim war scenes, no king smiting enemies, just movement, color, fluidity. One famous image shows a figure mid-air, flipping over the back of a charging bull. It looks impossible, athletic, almost playful. This was not a culture obsessed with rigid power symbols. It was a culture comfortable with grace. And then there is their pottery. Octopuses stretch their tentacles across curved surfaces. Spirals ripple like waves. The designs feel alive. You get the sense they understood the sea deeply, not as something to conquer, but something to dance with. Even their architecture feels less defensive than other Bronze Age powers. Some scholars believe their dominance at sea made walls unnecessary. If you control the water, you control the approach. Why build walls when you rule the horizon? But history is rarely gentle for long. About 100 miles north of Crete lies the island of Thera, modern Santorini. Around 1600 BCE, one of the largest volcanic eruptions in recorded human history exploded there. Ash shot into the sky. Tsunamis rolled across the sea. Shockwaves shattered coastlines. The town of Akrotiri on Thera was buried in ash, preserved like a Bronze Age time capsule. The eruption did not instantly erase the Minoans, but it weakened them, disrupted trade, damaged fleets, shook their world, literally. And when you are a maritime empire, the sea must remain predictable. The eruption made it wild. After that, something shifts. On Crete, we begin to see influence from mainland Greece. The Mycenaean Linear A script, still undeciphered, is gradually replaced by Linear B, an early form of Greek. Palaces burn, control changes hands. The Minoans do not go out in one dramatic final stand. They are absorbed, overtaken. Their identity dissolves into something new, which is sometimes how civilizations truly disappear. Not in fire, but in fusion. And then comes the legend. Plato, writing 1,000 years later, tells the story of Atlantis, a powerful island civilization swallowed by the sea. Scholars debate this endlessly. Was Atlantis inspired by the eruption of Thera? By the fall of the Minoans? We do not know. But here is what is interesting. When something vanishes suddenly, the human mind fills the gap with myth. Volcano becomes divine punishment. Economic collapse becomes a moral lesson. Real cities become cautionary tales. And memory transforms into story. Walk through the ruins of Knossos today, and you will see reconstructed columns painted red, bits of fresco restored, rooms open to the sky. The Mediterranean sun still pours into the courtyards. You can almost hear footsteps, the echo of sandals on stone. Laughter in a central plaza, the sound of waves against ships ready to depart, and it feels light, not heavy like a tomb, but airy, open. A civilization comfortable with beauty, comfortable with trade, comfortable with movement, until the earth itself reminded them that beauty is fragile. There is something quietly haunting about the Minoans. They mastered the sea. They painted joy on their walls. They built palaces without the oppressive bulk of later empires. And yet they are rarely mentioned outside footnotes, overshadowed by the Greeks who came after, reduced to a prelude. But for centuries, they were not a prelude. They were the center, the sea kings of their world. And perhaps that is the lesson here. You can dominate trade routes. You can design elegant spaces filled with light. You can master art and movement and connection, and still be forgotten by the main story. History tends to spotlight the loudest voices, the conquerors, the empire builders. But the Minoans remind us that influence can be fluid, soft, like waves. Their legacy survives in myth, in art styles, in echoes within Greek culture. But their name is often spoken quietly. So tonight, we let it linger a little longer. We pictured dolphins swimming across painted walls. We imagine ships cutting through blue water. We feel the tremor beneath the island when the volcano erupts. And we sit with the idea that even joyful civilizations can vanish. Not because they were weak, but because the earth does not negotiate. As the sun sets over Crete, the palace shadows stretch long. Wind moves through broken columns. The sea is calm again. It always becomes calm again. And beneath that calm surface lie stories of light-filled halls, daring acrobats, and a civilization that danced with bulls and ruled the waves, until the waves answered back. The Nabateans, 300 BCE to 106 CE. There is a city hidden behind stone. You do not see it from far away. You do not see it from the sky. You walk toward it through a narrow canyon called the Sick. The walls rise high on both sides, red, pink, gold. The air feels cooler there. Your footsteps echo. Then suddenly light opens, and carved into the cliff face is a facade, so precise it looks unreal. This is Petra, and it was built by a people who understood something simple. In the desert, water is power. The Nabateans began as nomads, traders moving across Arabia. They guided caravans through harsh terrain. They knew where wells were, where shade lasted longest, where storms gathered. Knowledge like that is wealth. By 300 BCE, they controlled key trade routes: frankincense from Arabia, myrrh, spices, silk from the east. Goods moving between Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean passed through their hands. Imagine the desert not as empty, but as a highway. Camels swaying slowly, bells clinking, sand stretching endlessly, and somewhere within it, a hidden capital carved into rock. Petra was not built out of blocks stacked upward. It was carved inward, into mountains. Stand before the treasury Al-Khazna and look up. Columns, pediments, decorative carvings, all sculpted directly from sandstone cliffs. No separate pieces, no assembly, just subtraction. Stone removed until beauty remained. It feels theatrical, almost cinematic. But Petra was not just about appearance. It was about survival. Rain in the desert is rare, but when it comes hard. Flash floods can tear through valleys and erase everything. The Nabateans engineered channels, dams, and underground cisterns to capture every drop. As you walk through the Sick, you can still see grooves cut into rock walls, ancient water conduits. They turned a dry canyon into a controlled hydraulic system. While other civilizations boasted about conquests, the Nabateans mastered gravity, which, honestly, is more practical. Petra was positioned cleverly, hidden, defensible by geography alone. High cliffs, narrow access points. You did not need massive walls when nature already built them, and because they controlled trade, they became wealthy. But here is what is interesting. The city blends cultures: Greek-style columns, Egyptian motifs, Roman influence, local Arabian identity. It does not scream purity. It whispers exchange. The Nabateans were cultural translators, middlemen of the ancient world, comfortable borrowing and adapting. Power, for them, was not about isolation. It was about connection. Walk further into Petra and you find tombs carved high into cliff faces, staircases leading to silence, interiors cool and empty. These were not rushed burials, they were statements. But even in death, the Nabateans chose cliffs over pyramids. They shaped the landscape rather than dominating it. There is a difference. One says, "Look how high we rise." The other says, "Look how well we fit." And then, like many trade-based powers, they faced a shift in geopolitics. Rome. In 106 CE, the Roman Empire annexed the Nabatean kingdom, not through total destruction, more through absorption. Petra became part of the Roman province, Arabia Petraea. Trade routes changed over time. Sea routes grew more dominant. Overland caravans declined. Wealth moved elsewhere. Without the pulse of caravans, Petra quieted. Buildings remained, but footsteps faded. Earthquakes damaged structures. Maintenance slowed. The city thinned. Eventually, Petra was largely abandoned. For centuries, it was known mostly to local Bedouin communities. The wider world forgot. Until 1812, when a Swiss explorer disguised himself as a pilgrim and was led through the Sick, and the treasury appeared again to foreign eyes. Imagine rediscovering a city carved into mountains. History does that sometimes. It hides things in plain sight. There is something almost poetic about Petra's story. A civilization that thrived by mastering what others feared. Desert heat, water scarcity, isolation. They turned those challenges into leverage. They built a capital that does not dominate the skyline, it becomes the skyline. And yet they are often overshadowed by Rome. Footnote, status, which feels unfair, because Rome marched. The Nabateans engineered. Rome built roads. The Nabateans built water security in a desert. One leaves legions. The other leaves channels in stone. As evening falls in Petra, the cliffs glow deep red. The air cools. Shadows lengthen across carved facades. You can sit quietly there and imagine the soft murmur of traders negotiating prices, the shuffle of camels, the splash of water in a hidden cistern. It does not feel like a city that failed. It feels like a city that fulfilled its purpose. Trade shifted, power realigned, and Petra stepped aside. No dramatic last stand, no final speech, just wind moving through carved doorways. There is a lesson in that. Civilizations built on connection are vulnerable to change, but they are also adaptable. The Nabateans were not conquerors in the usual sense. They conquered thirst, they conquered terrain, they conquered invisibility, and for centuries, they thrived because they understood something simple. Control the water, and you control the future, even if the future eventually forgets your name. As we leave Petra, the canyon narrows again. Stone closes in. The sky becomes a thin ribbon overhead. Behind us, a carved city rests in quiet dignity, not erased, just patient, waiting for those willing to walk through stone and look carefully. Because some kingdoms are not built to be seen from far away, they are built to be discovered. The Bactria Margiana archaeological complex 2300 to 1700 BCE. There is a desert in Central Asia where the wind does not hurry. It moves slowly over flat land, over cracked soil, over the ruins of something once powerful. This was the Oxus civilization. Modern scholars call it the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, which is a very academic way of saying we found something important in the middle of nowhere. One of its main cities was Gorna Tepe, and if you stood there 4,000 years ago, you would not think you were in the middle of nowhere at all. Picture it, an oasis in a dry land, mud brick walls rising from the plain, fortified compounds, towers watching the horizon, carefully planned neighborhoods arranged around central structures. This was not a wandering camp, this was urban, and it sat between great civilizations, Mesopotamia to the west, the Indus Valley to the south, steppe cultures to the north. The Oxus people were in the middle of everything, which is often the best place to be, and sometimes the most dangerous. Gorna Tepe reveals a city built with intention. Massive defensive walls, rectangular layouts, central complexes that may have served ritual or administrative purposes. Archaeologists have uncovered what appear to be fire temples, circular installations with ash deposits, carefully arranged spaces that suggest ceremony. Fire mattered here, water mattered too. Irrigation channels ran from the Murghab River delta, bringing life to otherwise harsh terrain. Once again, we see a pattern. Control water, build stability, ignore water, disappear. Ancient civilizations seem to agree on this point. Artifacts found at Oxus sites are fascinating. Stone seals, intricately carved figurines, jewelry made from lapis lazuli, objects that traveled across long trade networks. Lapis likely came from Afghanistan, other materials from distant lands. This was not an isolated desert culture. It was plugged into a Bronze Age web of exchange stretching thousands of miles. Imagine caravans crossing open steppe, dust rising behind them, traders carrying goods and ideas. Because trade does not just move objects, it moves beliefs, technologies, stories. The Oxus civilization may have influenced religious traditions that later spread widely. Some scholars even speculate connections to early Indo-Iranian cultural developments, but much remains uncertain. Their script, if they had one, has not survived clearly. Their language is lost, and without text, interpretation becomes careful guesswork. There is something haunting about their fortresses. Thick walls, defensive perimeters, controlled entrances. This was a world of shifting power. Nomadic groups moved across the steppe. Empires rose and fell nearby. Being in the middle meant staying alert. The architecture suggests organization, perhaps hierarchy, perhaps priestly authority tied to ritual fire. But unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, the Oxus civilization did not leave monumental stone inscriptions announcing their kings. They built in mud brick, which is practical, but less durable for eternity. Time prefers stone. Mud returns to dust, and that is part of why they were forgotten. When rivers shift, when irrigation fails, when climate patterns change, mud cities melt back into landscape. Around 1700 BCE, settlements begin to thin. Some sites show signs of gradual decline. Others suggest cultural blending with incoming groups from the steppe. There is no single dramatic collapse event we can point to, no clear final day, just transition, absorption, migration. The desert expands, it's quiet again. What is striking about the Oxus civilization is how advanced it was, and how rarely it is mentioned outside specialist circles. They built cities, they engineered irrigation, they participated in global Bronze Age trade, they developed distinctive artistic styles, and yet, they do not headline history textbooks. Why? Partly because they left fewer dramatic monuments, partly because they sit between more famous neighbors, and history often favors the loudest empires in the room. If you are sandwiched between Mesopotamia and the Indus, you risk becoming a footnote, even if your cities were impressive. There is a certain irony here. Modern archaeologists only began seriously uncovering Oxus sites in the 20th century. For millennia, the ruins lay beneath desert crust. Imagine that. A Bronze Age civilization erased so completely that only aerial surveys and patient excavation brought it back into view. It reminds us how incomplete our historical map still is. How many other civilizations are waiting quietly under soil? How many stories have not yet surfaced? As evening falls over the Turkmen desert, the ruins of Gonur Tepe cast long shadows. No marble gleam, no dramatic skyline, just low outlines of ancient walls. But if you listen closely, and you have a bit of imagination, you can almost hear it. The murmur of a market, the crackle of ritual fire, the distant approach of traders across open land. This was not a marginal culture. It was central, connected, adaptable, until conditions changed. There is a pattern forming in our journey. The Indus engineered cities without visible kings. The Minoans ruled waves with elegance. The Nabateans mastered desert water. Poverty Point reshaped earth without stone. And here, the Oxus civilization thrived between giants, each one advanced, each one sophisticated, each one largely forgotten. It makes you wonder how many major civilizations today might one day be reduced to scattered foundations and puzzled archaeologists. Humbling thought. Tonight, as wind brushes over desert ruins, remember this: greatness does not guarantee remembrance. Being central does not guarantee survival. And mud brick, no matter how carefully shaped, eventually returns to dust. But for 1,000 years, the Oxus civilization stood. It traded, it worshipped, it irrigated, it built. And under quiet stars, that is enough. History may have overlooked them, but the desert did not. It kept their outlines safe, waiting for someone to look closer. East Africa 100 to 940 CE, high in the northern Ethiopian highlands, where the air is thinner and the sky feels closer. There once stood a kingdom that rivaled Rome and Persia. It was called Axum, and for several centuries it was one of the most powerful states on earth. That is not exaggeration. In the 3rd century, a Persian prophet named Mani listed the 4 great powers of the world: Rome, Persia, China, and Axum. Pause on that. How often did your textbooks mention it alongside those names? Exactly. Picture the city of Axum around 300 CE. Stone palaces rising on stepped platforms, markets full of traders speaking multiple languages, camels loaded with ivory, gold measured carefully, incense drifting through warm air, and towering above it all, steely, massive carved stone monuments, some reaching over 20 meters high. They looked like skyscrapers carved from single blocks of granite. These were not random pillars, they marked royal tombs, but instead of pyramids, Axum chose vertical slabs carved with fake doors and windows, as if the dead still lived inside. It is architecture pretending to be architecture, and it is quietly brilliant. Axum's power came from geography. It sat near the Red Sea, linking Africa to Arabia and beyond. The port of Agilis connected the kingdom to trade networks stretching to India and the Mediterranean. Ivory from African elephants, gold from inland mines, exotic animals, textiles, spices, Axumite coins have been found far beyond Ethiopia's borders. Yes, coins. They minted their own currency in gold, silver, and bronze, with royal portraits stamped clearly. This was not an isolated kingdom. This was a global player. And then something transformative happened. In the 4th century, under King Arzana, Axum adopted Christianity. Not gradually, officially, it became one of the earliest Christian states in the world. Centuries before many parts of Europe, coins began to feature the cross. Royal inscriptions shifted in tone. The kingdom aligned itself with a new spiritual identity. Religion, once again, shaped geopolitics. But Axum did not erase its older traditions overnight. Cultures rarely pivot that cleanly. There was continuity, blending, adaptation. Walk today among the steely fields in Axum, and you see the scale. Some stand tall, some lie broken, toppled long ago. One of the largest ever carved fell during construction. Even ancient engineers miscalculated sometimes, which is comforting, because if you are going to move a 500-ton stone slab, precision matters. The engineering required to quarry, transport, and erect these monuments was extraordinary. No modern cranes, No steel cables, just manpower, ramps, and knowledge passed carefully between generations. When you stand beside one, you feel small, which may have been the point. But Axum was not only about monuments, it developed its own script. Ge'ez still used liturgically today in Ethiopia. It produced inscriptions in multiple languages, including Greek. It maintained diplomatic ties across the Red Sea. At one point, Axum even projected military power into Arabia. This was not a quiet backwater. It was assertive, confident, sophisticated. And then, gradually, things changed. Trade routes shifted. The rise of Islamic caliphates in the 7th century altered Red Sea dynamics. Maritime power realigned. Axum's coastal access became less secure. Economic flow tightened. There may have been environmental strain as well. Deforestation, soil exhaustion, agricultural pressure. Civilizations depend on balance. When trade weakens and land suffers, even strong kingdoms wobble. By the 10th century, Axum's dominance had faded. Power centers moved southward within Ethiopia. The city declined. The stele remained silent. There is something deeply moving about Axum's story. Unlike many forgotten civilizations, it is not entirely lost. Modern Ethiopia carries threads of Axumite heritage, language, religion, identity. But globally, its legacy is often minimized, overshadowed by Rome's drama, by Persia's intrigue, by China's dynasties. And yet, for centuries, Axum stood among them, equal, recognized, respected. As the sun sets in the Ethiopian highlands, the stone stele cast long thin shadows across the ground. The air cools quickly. Silence settles. You can imagine merchants once passing through gates, priests chanting, coins clinking in trade. Now, only wind brushes against carved granite, but the stones still stand. They do not beg for attention. They do not shout. They simply remain. There is a pattern again. Indus-engineered order. Minoans danced with the sea. Nabateans mastered water. Poverty point-shaped earth. Oxus thrived between giants. And Axum stood as a global power few now remember properly. It reminds us that history's spotlight is selective. Some civilizations are placed center stage. Others wait in sidelight, even when they once commanded the world's respect. Tonight, imagine standing beside one of Axum's towering stele. Place your hand against cool stone carved 1600 years ago. You look up, and up, and up. It feels steady, grounded, rooted. Civilizations may fade, trade routes may shift, but stone remembers weight. And Axum's stones still hold theirs, quietly, patiently, under a sky that has watched empires come and go. Great Zimbabwe, 1100 to 1450 CE, in the southeastern hills of Africa, where granite rises from the earth in rounded outcrops. There stands a city built from stone. Not small stone, not decorative stone, but massive granite blocks, stacked carefully without mortar. This is Great Zimbabwe, and for centuries it was the heart of a powerful African kingdom. Imagine approaching the city in the 14th century. You would see tall, curving walls rising from the landscape. Some stretch over 800 feet long, some stand over 30 feet high. No cement, no binding paste, just precision. Each block shaped and placed so carefully that gravity does the rest. It feels almost impossible, but it is not magic. It is skill. Great Zimbabwe was not a random settlement. It was the political and economic center of a kingdom that controlled trade routes stretching to the Indian Ocean. Gold flowed from mines in the interior, ivory from elephants. Cattle to cattle were wealth here. Merchants carried goods to coastal cities like Kilwa, where they entered Indian Ocean trade networks connecting to Arabia, India, even China. Chinese porcelain has been found in the ruins. Pause on that. Chinese ceramics in southern Africa in the 1300s. The world was connected long before modern maps showed neat lines. The most striking part of the site is called the Great Enclosure, a massive circular wall enclosing a large space with a conical tower inside. The purpose of the tower is debated. Storage, symbol of authority, ritual meaning. What matters is not just what it was for, but that it was built with intention, with labor, with organization. This was not a small tribe stacking rocks casually. This was state-level coordination. And yet, when European explorers encountered the ruins in the 19th century, many refused to believe Africans built them. They claimed Phoenicians must have done it, or Arabs, or some lost biblical civilization. Anything but local African architects. The idea that sub-Saharan Africans built monumental stone cities disrupted colonial narratives, so the story was distorted. For decades, history was rewritten to erase African agency, which is its own kind of collapse, a collapse of truth. Archaeology eventually corrected the record. Radiocarbon dating, cultural continuity, linguistic evidence. Great Zimbabwe was built by ancestors of the Shona, people, African, ingenious, local. The walls are not just architectural achievements, they are corrections. They stand as quiet rebuttals to centuries of dismissal. Life inside Great Zimbabwe would have been layered. The hill complex likely housed elite leadership. The great enclosure may have had ceremonial or royal functions. Common dwellings filled surrounding areas. There was hierarchy, yes, but also vibrancy. Markets, cattle enclosures, metalworking, stone carving. Among the most famous artifacts are the Zimbabwe birds, soapstone carvings of stylized birds perched on columns. They are elegant, abstract, symbolic. Today, the bird appears on Zimbabwe's national flag, an ancient symbol carried forward. History is not always broken. Sometimes it continues. Around the 15th century, Great Zimbabwe begins to decline. Again, no dramatic invasion narrative dominates. Instead, resource strain may have played a role. Deforestation from construction and fuel use, overgrazing, shifting trade routes. As coastal trade centers grew stronger, inland control weakened. Political power shifted northward to the kingdom of Mutapa. Great Zimbabwe was gradually abandoned. Stone walls remained, but voices faded. Walk through the ruins today, and the silence feels heavy. The walls curve like frozen waves. The grass grows between stones. The conical tower stands still. No mortar has cracked because there was none to begin with. There is something poetic about that. A city built to hold itself together without glue. And in many ways, it still does. There is a pattern forming again. Indus built order without kings carved in stone. Minoans painted joy before volcanic ash fell. Nabateans carved water channels into desert. Poverty Point shaped earth without agriculture. Oxus thrived between giants. Oxum stood among global powers, and Great Zimbabwe rose from granite, only to be doubted centuries later. Sometimes civilizations are not just forgotten, they are misrepresented, which might be worse. Tonight, imagine standing within the great enclosure, the sky wide above you, granite walls curving around like protective arms. You placed your hand on a stone block that was shaped and positioned over 600 years ago. It is steady, solid, no cement required. It makes you think about what truly holds societies together. Trust, trade, shared belief. Stone can be stacked without mortar, but memory sometimes needs reinforcement. As the sun lowers over southern Africa, shadows stretch across the ruins. The air cools. Birds settle into trees growing between ancient walls. Great Zimbabwe does not beg for recognition. It does not shout its accomplishments. It simply stands. Proof that complexity thrived here. Proof that trade connected continents. Proof that African civilizations built in stone, in gold, in story. And though its political power shifted, its presence remains, unmoved, unapologetic. Quietly correcting the record, we leave the granite hills slowly. Behind us, curved walls catch the last light. Another civilization remembered, another silence broken gently, and ahead of us, more forgotten worlds waiting under dust and jungle and time. Let's go way back, not to Rome, not to Egypt, not even to the pyramids of Giza. We're heading to the dry valleys of coastal Peru, around 3000 BCE, while other parts of the world were just figuring out cities. Something was already rising here, quietly. No metal tools, no pottery, no flashy kings shouting their names into stone. Just sand, stone, and ambition. Welcome to Norte Chico. At the center of it all stands Caral. Wide plazas, massive platform mounds, sunken circular courts. The kind of layout that says, we planned this. And here's the wild part. This civilization built monumental architecture without pottery. No clay jars, no decorated bowls, no ceramic leftovers for archaeologists to obsess over. It's like they skipped a whole tech tree. So how did they do it? Stone woven reed bags filled with rocks. Labor, lots of labor. Someone had to organize that. Someone had to feed workers. Someone had to manage logistics. That means leadership. That means systems. But we don't see giant statues of rulers. No royal tombs packed with gold. No dramatic murals of conquest. Instead, we find musical instruments, flutes carved from bird bones, cornets made from deer antlers. Think about that. In one of the oldest civilizations in the Americas, we find music, not swords, not battle scenes. Music. Maybe power here didn't scream. Maybe it hummed. Norte Chico thrived on trade between the coast and inland valleys. Fish from the Pacific, cotton from farms, shared resources, shared structure. And then, slowly, it fades. No dramatic invasion, no fiery destruction layer, just a gradual shift. People move, systems change, the desert stays. The wind keeps blowing across the plazas. Caral doesn't collapse with a bang, it just becomes quiet, and that quiet lasts thousands of years, until we dig it up again. We like to say oldest civilization in the Americas like it's a medal, but standing in Caral today, it feels different. It feels humble. No flashy empire energy. No look at us inscriptions. Just stone platforms under a hot sun. It's a reminder that complexity doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like coordination, ritual, shared belief. And sometimes the first chapter of a continent's history is written without pottery, which is kind of iconic. Norte Chico didn't leave behind epic war stories. It left architecture, music, and mystery, and that's enough.
Now we leave the quiet deserts of Peru and travel to rugged Anatolia. Different continent, different climate, different energy. If Norte Chico hummed, the Hittites roared, around 1600 BCE in what is now central Turkey. A kingdom rose that would become one of the great powers of the late Bronze Age. Their capital was Hattusa, a city, wrapped in thick stone walls, guarded by massive gates carved with lions and warriors. You don't carve lions into stone if you're feeling shy. The Hittites were not quiet. They were rivals of giants. Most famously, they stood toe-to-toe with Egypt. Yes, that Egypt. At the height of their power, the Hittite Empire controlled large parts of Anatolia and northern Syria. They commanded trade routes, vassal states, and military forces that could challenge the best armies of the age. They did. The clash between the Hittites and Egypt reached its dramatic peak at the Battle of Kadesh around 1274 BCE on one side, Pharaoh Ramesses II. On the other, the Hittite king Muwatalli II. Chariots thundered across the battlefield. Bronze weapons flashed. Dust filled the air. Both sides claimed victory, of course. Ancient PR was strong. But here's the interesting part. Instead of endless war, they signed a peace treaty. One of the earliest recorded international peace treaties in history. It's not small. It shows diplomacy, negotiation, recognition of equal power. The Hittites were not just warriors. They were administrators. lawmakers, diplomats, and they left behind something Norchico did not: writing. Thousands of clay tablets have been found at Hattusa. They used cuneiform, adapted for Mesopotamia, to record treaties, laws, myths, and royal correspondence. So unlike Caral's silence, Hattusa speaks. It speaks in legal codes that show a surprisingly nuanced system. Some punishments were harsh, yes, but compared to other Bronze Age law codes, Hittite laws sometimes seem almost practical. They also preserved myths from multiple cultures: Hattian, Hurrian, Mesopotamian. Their empire absorbed people, and with them, stories. This wasn't cultural isolation. It was cultural layering. And then there's the iron question. The Hittites are often linked with early iron use. For a long time, they were seen as the secret masters of iron technology, guarding it like a cheat code. Modern scholarship suggests iron was rare and mostly ceremonial during their peak. Bronze still dominated. But even limited ironworking gave them prestige. Iron is tougher than bronze, harder to produce, more symbolic. It hinted at the future, because soon the world would shift from bronze to iron in a way no one fully expected. But before we get to collapse, let's walk through Hattusa. The city sat on a rocky landscape, surrounded by massive fortification walls stretching several kilometers. Gates like the Lion Gate and the King's Gate were not just functional, they were statements. Enter here, and you enter power. Inside there were temples, royal residences, administrative buildings. One of the most striking religious sites nearby is Yatzilakaya, an open-air rock sanctuary carved with reliefs of gods marching in procession, rows of deities, each distinct, etched into stone. It's dramatic. It's theatrical. It's cosmic. The Hittite king was not just a ruler, he was a mediator between gods and humans. Religion and politics were tightly intertwined. And for a time, it worked. The Hittite Empire expanded. It controlled key territories. It negotiated with Egypt, managed vassals across a wide region. But empires are complicated machines. They require constant balance. Vassal states must stay loyal. Trade routes must stay open. Harvests must be stable. Enemies must be managed. And then, around 1200 BCE, the entire eastern Mediterranean world began to shake. This is what historians call the Bronze Age collapse. Major civilizations, Mycenaean Greece, parts of the Levant, the Hittite Empire, began to fall within a relatively short span. Cities burned, trade networks fractured, writing systems disappeared in some regions. It's one of ancient history's great mysteries. For the Hittites, the collapse was sudden and total. By around 1178 BCE, Hattusa was abandoned. Burned layers suggest destruction. But by whom? Possibly invading groups often labeled Sea Peoples. Possibly internal rebellion. Possibly famine, drought, or economic breakdown. Maybe all of the above. When complex systems are under stress, they don't fail from one crack. They fail from many. Imagine supply lines weakening, grain shortages, vassals refusing tribute, external raiders testing borders. An empire stretched thin snaps, and once it snaps, recovery is hard. The Hittite central authority disappeared. Anatolia fragmented into smaller Neo-Hittite states in the south, but the great empire was gone. Hattusa, once roaring with administration and ritual, fell silent. Unlike Norchico, this silence came with fire. The Bronze Age world contracted. Literacy declined in some areas, long-distance trade shrank. It was not just a political collapse, it was systemic. The Hittites, who once negotiated as equals with Egypt, vanished from the stage. For centuries, they were almost forgotten. Even in later classical texts, references to them are vague. It wasn't until the 19th and early 20th centuries that archaeologists rediscovered Hattusa and deciphered Hittite texts. Suddenly, a lost empire returned to memory. What we found was not a minor kingdom. It was a superpower. There's something sobering about that. Civilization powerful enough to challenge Egypt, organized enough to draft international treaties, sophisticated enough to maintain a vast bureaucracy. Gone, not slowly absorbed. Not gently transformed, it's gone in a wave of regional collapse. It reminds us how fragile, interconnected systems can be. Trade dependence is strength until it's vulnerability. Diplomacy is stability until partners fall. Technological prestige like early iron means little if food supplies fail. Standing at Hattusa today, you see broken walls, scattered stones, carved reliefs weathered by time. The Lion Gate still stands, though worn. The gods at Yatzilakaya still march in stone procession, but the voices that once filled those halls are silent. Unlike the peaceful fading of North Chico, the Hittite story has sharp edges. It has chariots and treaties. It has gods carved into cliffs. It has sudden destruction. And yet, even here, disappearance is not absolute. Elements of Hittite culture flowed into successor states. Legal ideas influenced neighbors. Mythologies blended into broader Near Eastern traditions. Empires fall, ideas travel. And sometimes what survives is not the throne, but the treaty. The peace treaty between the Hittites and Egypt is still known today. A copy even hangs at the United Nations as a symbol of early diplomacy. That's legacy, not in walls, not in crowns, but in the concept that even rivals can choose agreement over annihilation. The Hittites remind us that power can be loud, can carve lions into gates and gods into mountains. But even loud power is temporary. Around 1600 BCE, they rose from Anatolia and built something formidable. By 1178 BCE, it was ash and memory. The Bronze Age world shifted. Iron would come. New empires would rise. But for a few centuries, in the highlands of Anatolia, the Hittites stood as equals to the greatest powers on earth. And then, the system broke. Their story is not just about rivalry with Egypt or early iron use. It's about the vulnerability of complexity, about how even strong walls cannot hold back cascading crises, about how an empire that roared can fall into silence faster than it expects. And as we leave the stones of Hattusa behind, we carry that lesson forward. Civilizations are not just built on strength, they are built on balance. And when balance fails, even lions carved in stone cannot roar forever.
After the Bronze Age world cracked, new powers began rising from the rubble. One of them grew not in flat river valleys, but in mountains, high cold, defensive by default. Welcome to Urartu. Around the 9th century BCE, in the Armenian highlands near Lake Van A kingdom formed that would become one of Assyria's most persistent rivals. If the Hittites were diplomatic heavyweights with lion gates, the Urartians were fortress builders with altitude on their side. Their world was rock, and they mastered it. The heart of their power lay around Lake Van, in what is today eastern Turkey. From there, they expanded across rugged terrain, building strongholds on hilltops, carving inscriptions into cliffs, and creating a network of fortified cities that looked like they grew straight out of stone. This was not a soft landscape. It was dramatic. Steep ridges, harsh winters, limited farmland. So Urartu did what smart mountain kingdoms do. They engineered. Let's talk irrigation. You don't thrive in highland terrain without controlling water. Urartian rulers built extensive canal systems to bring water from mountain streams to agricultural lands and urban centers. Some of these canals stretched dozens of kilometers, and parts of them still function today. That's not improvisation. That's long-term planning. They understood that power in the highlands didn't just come from walls, it came from food security, and they paired irrigation with fortresses. Massive stone citadels crowned hills, thick defensive walls, strategic placement overlooking valleys and trade routes. One of the most iconic sites is Van Fortress, towering above the landscape. From up there, you see everything, which was kind of the point. Urartu rose in direct competition with the Neo-Assyrian Empire to the south, and Assyria was not subtle. Assyrian kings carved dramatic reliefs of conquests into palace walls. They documented campaigns with enthusiasm. Urartu appears frequently in those records, sometimes as enemy, sometimes as rival. Assyrian kings bragged about defeating Hittitan armies. Hittitan kings carved inscriptions celebrating their own victories. It was a back and forth, mountain power versus imperial machine. Urartian inscriptions, written in a form of cuneiform, adapted from Assyria, tell us about kings like Sardurii, Menua, Argishtii, and Rusai. These were not minor chiefs. They expanded territory, built cities, founded administrative centers. Argishtii, for example, founded the fortress of Erebuni in 782 BCE near modern-day Yerevan. The city's roots trace back to Urartian foundations. That's continuity. Urartian society was hierarchical. The king stood at the top, closely tied to religion. The chief deity was Holdi, a war god often depicted standing on a lion. There's that lion again. Apparently, ancient Near Eastern powers loved a good lion symbol. Temples were built within fortresses, ritual and rule intertwined. But Urartu's identity wasn't just military. Their metalwork was refined. Bronze shields decorated with intricate patterns, helmets with embossed designs, cauldrons with stylized animal heads, functional objects made artistic. They also managed trade networks that connected Anatolia, the Caucasus, and Mesopotamia. Even in rugged terrain, you cannot isolate yourself completely. Goods moved, ideas moved, and yet, like many regional powers, Urartu existed in the shadow of Assyria. Assyria was larger, more centralized, more aggressive in its propaganda. But Urartu endured. For about 2 centuries, it remained a serious regional force, which is impressive given the pressure. Now, here's where the story tightens. By the late 7th century BCE, Assyria itself began to weaken. Internal strife, external invasions. The mighty Neo-Assyrian Empire, once terrifying in its military dominance, began to crumble. You might expect Urartu to benefit, but history is rarely that clean. As Assyria declined, new forces emerged. The Medes from the Iranian plateau, Scythian groups moving through the region, shifting alliances, instability everywhere. Urartu found itself in a volatile neighborhood, and then, around 590 BCE, it disappears from historical records. No dramatic final battle etched in stone, no clear single event marking its end, just silence. Some scholars suggest it was absorbed by the expanding Median Empire. Others point to invasions or internal collapse. Archaeological layers show destruction at some sites, burned fortresses, abandoned cities, but the picture is fragmented. It feels less like one decisive moment and more like gradual erosion under pressure. Mountain fortresses can defend against armies. They cannot defend against systemic geopolitical shifts forever. And yet, Urartu did not vanish completely. Its cultural and political structures likely influenced the later kingdom of Armenia. Some historians even see Urartu as a foundational layer in Armenian state formation. Again, transformation, not total erasure. Let's step back for a moment. Urartu's strength lay in 3 things: fortresses, irrigation, strategic geography. Fortresses gave defense, irrigation gave food, geography gave leverage. It's a smart formula, but formulas depend on stability. When the larger regional system destabilizes, when Assyria falls, when new nomadic groups move in, when empires shift, even a mountain kingdom must adapt fast. An adaptation at imperial scale is not easy. There's also something symbolic about Urartu's stone architecture. Their fortresses were built to last. Large stone blocks fitted carefully, walls integrated into bedrock. Standing at Van Fortress today, you feel the permanence they aimed for. Solid, elevated, immovable. And yet, the political structure behind those stones did move. It shifted, it dissolved. Stone remains, states do not. Urartu's irrigation canals are another quiet legacy. water channels carved through rock, guiding life into dry zones. It's almost poetic. In a region defined by rugged terrain, they carved lines of sustenance through stone. Control water, and you control survival. That's a lesson as old as civilization. And in that sense, Urartu fits into a broader pattern we've seen before. Norte Chico engineered irrigation in desert valleys. The Hittites managed trade and diplomacy across contested lands. Urartu engineered survival in mountains. Different environments, same principle. Complex societies rise where humans solve environmental challenges at scale. But solving environment is only half the equation. You must also solve politics, and politics is harder. Urartu balanced between powerful neighbors for generations. It expanded, defended, and consolidated. But when the regional chessboard flipped, it could not maintain position. By the 6th century BCE, the political landscape of the Near East looked very different. The Achaemenid Persian Empire would soon rise under Cyrus the Great. The Medes would merge into larger imperial structures. Urartu became a layer beneath these new powers. Its fortresses stood, its irrigation flowed, but its royal inscriptions stopped, and that silence tells its own story. Unlike the Hittites, whose collapse was tied to a broader Bronze Age crisis, Urartu's fall feels like absorption into a new order. Less apocalypse, more transition, but transitions can be just as final. The name Urartu fades from official use. A new identity, Armenia, eventually emerges in the region. Cultural memory reshapes itself. It's humbling, because Urartu did everything right by ancient standards. Strong defenses, organized administration, agricultural infrastructure, military resilience, and still, it lasted about 270 years as a major kingdom. That's long in human terms, short in geological ones. Walking through the ruins today, you see thick walls overlooking vast landscapes. You see inscriptions praising kings and gods. You see evidence of planning, ambition, confidence. They believed they were building something durable, and they were, just not in the way they expected. The political entity dissolved. The cultural foundations endured. Urartu teaches a specific kind of lesson. Height gives perspective, but not immunity. Engineering buys time, but not eternity. Rival empires can fall, and still take you with them in the aftermath. Mountain kingdoms feel permanent, until they aren't, and yet their stones still stand in the wind. Their canals still whisper water across dry land. Their names still surface in carved cuneiform, etched deep into rock faces. The kingdom of Urartu may have disappeared from maps around 590 BCE, but its imprint remains carved into the highlands. Another civilization that rose with strategy, balanced power against geography, engineered survival against climate, and ultimately yielded to the slow, relentless reshaping of history. Fortresses crumble, water keeps flowing, and the mountains watch it all. Now we move south, south of Egypt, south of the familiar pharaohs and pyramids of Giza, into Nubia. For a long time, history books treated Nubia like a footnote, a neighbor, a trade partner, sometimes an enemy. But Nubia was not just reacting to Egypt. It built its own kingdom, it built its own pyramids, and for a while it ruled Egypt. Welcome to the kingdom of Kush. Around 1070 BCE, as Egypt entered one of its weaker periods, a powerful state emerged in Nubia, centered first at Napata and later at Meru. This was not a fringe culture copying Egypt. This was a civilization with deep roots, drawing from both African traditions and long interaction with the Nile world. Let's clear something up right away. Yes, they built pyramids, but Nubian pyramids look different. They are smaller, steeper, more sharply angled than their Egyptian cousins, and there are a lot of them. The Royal Cemetery at Meru contains dozens of pyramids clustered tightly together. It's almost surreal. Sharp stone triangles rising from desert sand under a wide Sudanese sky. These were tombs for kings and queens. And yes, queens. The kingdom of Kush had powerful ruling women known as kandaks. These were not ceremonial figures. Some led armies, some negotiated with Rome. That's not background history. That's center stage. Now, the relationship between Kush and Egypt is complicated. For centuries, Nubia had been influenced by Egyptian culture through trade, conquest, and proximity. Egyptian gods, art styles, and hieroglyphic writing left their mark. But influence is not erasure. Around the 8th century BCE, Kushite kings moved north and conquered Egypt. Let that sink in. Nubian rulers became pharaohs of Egypt during what historians call the 25th dynasty. Kings like Pi and Taharqa ruled both Nubia and Egypt. They revived old Egyptian traditions, restored temples, and presented themselves as legitimate pharaohs. This wasn't invasion for destruction. It was revival through new leadership. For a brief period, the political center of the Nile world shifted south. But empires are never alone. The Assyrians, yes, the same aggressive empire we saw earlier, pushed into Egypt and forced Kushite rulers to retreat back south. The Kushite dynasty in Egypt ended, but Kush itself did not collapse. It adjusted. The capital gradually shifted from Napata to Meru, farther south. And this is where Kush truly became something distinct. Meru was not just a political center, it was industrial. The region had access to iron ore and timber. That combination is powerful. Kush became a major iron-producing center in Africa. Iron tools, iron weapons, iron trade. Some scholars even call Meru the Birmingham of Africa in antiquity. Maybe not the most poetic nickname, but you get the idea. Industry means economy. Economy means resilience. And Meru thrived for centuries. Trade routes linked Kush to sub-Saharan Africa, the Red Sea, and the Mediterranean world. Gold, ivory, ebony, exotic animals all flowed through its networks. And culturally, Kush was evolving. While early Kushite rulers used Egyptian hieroglyphs, the later Meroitic period developed its own script, the Meroitic script. This is huge. A distinct writing system. It means administrative complexity. It means cultural identity. It means intellectual independence. Here's the twist though. We still haven't fully deciphered We can read the characters phonetically, but the language itself remains partly mysterious. So the kingdom of Kush speaks, but softly. We hear echoes, names, titles, ritual phrases, but full stories remain locked, which gives the civilization a kind of haunting quality. We see pyramids, we see inscriptions, we see temples, but we don't fully hear their voice. Religion in Kush blended influences. Egyptian gods like Amun remained important, especially at Jebel Barkal near Napata. But local traditions also shaped belief systems. Temples rose in both Egyptian style and unique Meroitic forms. Art shifted to figures in Meroitic art often look distinct, different proportions, clothing styles, and symbolism compared to Egyptian art. It's cultural confidence, not imitation, not rebellion, evolution. Now, let's talk about those pyramids again. Unlike the massive, widely spaced pyramids of Giza, Nubian pyramids clustered together in tight cemeteries. Many were looted in the 19th century. Some were even partially destroyed by treasure hunters who thought blasting them open was a good idea. Spoiler, it wasn't. Still, enough remains to show scale. Royal burial chambers beneath the pyramids contained goods, jewelry, and symbolic items for the afterlife. Afterlife belief mattered here, just as it did in Egypt. Kings and queens expected continuity beyond death, and that expectation shaped architecture. Kush endured far longer than many assume. From around 1070 BCE to roughly 350 CE, that's over 1,000 years of cultural continuity. That's not a minor episode, that's longevity. So what ended it? Like many ancient states, Kush faced layered pressures. Trade patterns shifted. The rise of Aksum in modern Ethiopia created new competition in Red Sea trade. Environmental stress may have affected agricultural productivity. Overuse of timber for iron smelting might have contributed to deforestation. And then there were external conflicts. By around 350 CE, the kingdom of Aksum invaded and weakened Kush significantly. Urban centers declined. Royal pyramid buildings stopped. Meru faded. But again, fade does not mean erase. Kush's influence rippled outward. Its legacy shaped later Nubian kingdoms like Nobusha, Makuria, and Alodia. Cultural identity in the region did not vanish. It transformed. And perhaps most importantly, Kush challenges old narratives. For too long, ancient African civilizations south of Egypt were underrepresented in mainstream history. Kush stands as undeniable proof of complexity, sovereignty, and innovation in ancient Africa. It ruled Egypt. It built pyramids. It developed its own script. It managed long-distance trade networks. It industrialized iron production. And it sustained itself for over a millennium. That's not peripheral history. That's central. Standing among the pyramids of Meru today feels different from standing at Giza. There are fewer tourists, more wind. The pyramids are steeper, smaller, clustered like sharp teeth rising from sand. The silence is heavy, but it's not empty, it's layered. You can almost feel the continuity of rulers buried beneath each pyramid. Queens who commanded armies, kings who ruled two lands, artisans who carved symbols into stone in a script we still struggle to fully understand. There's humility in that, because even with modern scholarship, we don't know everything. We can measure pyramid angles, we can carbon date materials, we can map trade routes, but we cannot fully reconstruct their inner world. And maybe that's okay. The kingdom of Kush reminds us that history is broader than the familiar Mediterranean arc. It reminds us that Africa was not waiting for influence, it was generating it. It also reminds us that power can move south as easily as north. Egypt once dominated Nubia, then Nubia ruled Egypt. Then both shifted under new empires. Cycles, always cycles. And through it all, along the Nile's southern stretches, Kush carved its identity into desert stone. Distinct pyramids, distinct script, distinct rulers. When Meru declined around 350 CE, it did not explode in one final dramatic blaze. It thinned. Trade slowed. Authority weakened. Urban life receded. The pyramids remained. Sharp silhouettes under sun. The desert reclaimed streets. But the name Kush still echoes in scholarship, in archaeology, in cultural memory. It is no longer a footnote. It is a chapter, a long one, a powerful one. The kingdom of Kush proves that civilizations can absorb influence without losing themselves. They can rule former overlords. They can innovate, adapt, and endure for centuries. And even when their script goes quiet and their cities empty, their stone triangles still point upward, toward sky, toward time, toward the reminder that greatness has many centers. And some of them rise south of where we usually look. Now we shift to Italy, not Rome. Before Caesars, before legions, before marble statues doing dramatic poses, we're going back to a people who shaped Rome, and then disappeared inside it, the Etruscans. Around 900 BCE, in central Italy, a culture began to flourish across what is now Tuscany, Lazio, and parts of Umbria. They didn't call themselves Etruscans. The Romans did. They likely called themselves the Rosicna, but history remembers them as Etruscans. And if you've ever admired Roman engineering, religious ritual, or even the toga, you might owe the Etruscans a quiet thank you. Let's start with cities. Etruscan settlements were not random clusters of huts. They were organized urban centers built on hilltops, defensible, strategic, and planned. Cities like Tarquinia, Vigi, and Cerveteri became powerful hubs, each operating almost like independent city-states. This wasn't one unified empire. It was a league of cities, connected by culture, religion, and trade. And they were wealthy. Trade routes linked them to the Greeks, the Phoenicians, and other Mediterranean powers. They exported metal goods, especially iron, from Elba, and imported fine ceramics and luxury items. Metalwork was one of their strengths. Bronze mirrors with intricate engravings, elaborate jewelry, sculpted sarcophagi with lifelike faces reclining as if at eternal dinner parties. They liked style. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Much of what we know about the Etruscans comes from their tombs, which sounds dramatic, and it kind of is. The necropolises, literal cities of the dead, at places like Tarquinia and Cerveteri are vast. Underground tomb chambers carved into rock, and inside, paintings, colorful frescoes, showing banquets, dancing, musicians, athletes, everyday life. Unlike the more rigid, symbolic art of Egypt, Etruscan tomb paintings feel lively. People smile. They recline casually. They play instruments. It feels almost cheerful, which suggests their view of the afterlife may have been less grim than some of their neighbors. They buried their dead with care, with goods, with art. Death was not the end of identity. Now, let's talk language. The Etruscan language is one of the great puzzles of ancient Europe. We can read it. We know the alphabet. It was derived from Greek and influenced the Latin alphabet. But understanding the language fully, that's harder. It's not Indo-European like Latin. It stands apart. We can identify names, titles, some basic terms, but large parts remain unclear. So again, we have a civilization that speaks to us, but partially. Fragments, and that mystery adds texture. Religiously, the Etruscans were deeply ritualistic. They believed the gods communicated through signs in nature, lightning, bird flight patterns, the arrangement of animal entrails during sacrifice. Yes, entrails. Divination was serious business. Haruspis' priests, trained to interpret the will of the gods, examined the livers of sacrificed animals to predict outcomes. It sounds intense. It was. But here's the twist. Rome adopted much of this. Roman religion, especially in its early forms, borrowed heavily from Etruscan ritual practices. Even the structure of Roman temples shows Etruscan influence. High podiums, frontal staircases, deep porches, and then there are the kings of early Rome. According to Roman tradition, several of Rome's early kings were Etruscan. Figures like Tarquinius Priscus and Tarquinius Supervis. Whether every detail is accurate or not, the cultural influence is undeniable. The Etruscans helped shape early Roman political and religious structures, which makes their eventual disappearance into Rome almost ironic, because for a time, they were dominant. In the 6th century BCE, Etruscan power reached its peak. They controlled large parts of central Italy and influenced trade across the Tyrrhenian Sea. But power built on city leagues has vulnerabilities. Unlike centralized empires, the Etruscans operated through independent cities. Coordination could be fragile. Meanwhile, Rome was growing, and Rome was organized, disciplined, relentless. After expelling its last king, traditionally the Etruscan Tarquinius Superbus, Rome transitioned into a republic, and then it expanded. Slowly at first, then aggressively. City by city, Rome absorbed Etruscan territories, some through war, some through alliance, some through gradual integration. Vigi fell in 396 BCE after a long siege. Other cities followed. By the 3rd century BCE, Etruscan political independence was effectively over. But cultural absorption is not instant erasure. Etruscan elites became Roman citizens. Etruscan religious experts continued advising Roman officials. Artistic styles blended. The language, however, gradually declined. Latin replaced it in public life. By around the 1st century BCE, Etruscan was largely extinct as a spoken language, and that's the strange part. Unlike Kush, which left pyramids in desert isolation, the Etruscans were absorbed into one of the most famous civilizations in history. They didn't collapse in flames, they dissolved. Inside Rome, it's like being edited out of your own sequel, but their fingerprints remain everywhere. The Roman toga likely evolved from Etruscan dress. Roman triumph ceremonies echoed Etruscan rituals. Even the Roman concept of fasces, the bundle of rods symbolizing authority, traces back to Etruscan tradition. So when we picture Rome, we are partially picturing Etruria, and yet, ask most people about the Etruscans, and you get a blank look. That's how complete absorption can be. Their cities became Roman municipalities, their gods merged with Roman ones, their language faded, but their foundations stayed embedded. Standing in the necropolis at Tarquinia today feels almost intimate. You descend into tomb chambers carved 2,500 years ago. The walls still carry paintings of dancers, banquets, musicians. The colors have faded, but the expressions remain. It feels personal, not imperial. The Etruscans were not obsessed with conquest on a Mediterranean scale. They were obsessed with ritual precision, artistic expression, and urban sophistication. And they were comfortable with luxury. Unlike the austere image Rome later cultivated, Etruscan society seems to have embraced pleasure, feasting, music, elaborate goods. Women appear prominently in tomb art, sometimes reclining alongside men at banquets, a social role that shocked Greek observers at the time, which suggests Etruscan society may have offered women relatively higher status compared to some neighboring cultures. That alone challenges assumptions. Now, let's zoom out. Why do the Etruscans matter in a broader story of forgotten civilizations? Because they show a different type of disappearance. Not dramatic collapse, not invasion from distant lands, assimilation. They were influential enough to shape Rome, but not dominant enough to survive Rome's expansion intact. And Rome, unlike most ancient states, did not just conquer, it absorbed, it standardized, it Latinized. Over time, Etruscan identity thinned into Roman identity. The distinct language went quiet. The city league system faded. But the art, the rituals, the architectural principles, those lived on. In marble forums, in senate ceremonies, in triumphal parades, the Etruscans remind us that not all civilizations end in rubble. Some end in transformation so complete that their name becomes secondary to what they helped build. Their story also reminds us that cultural influence can outlast political sovereignty. You can lose independence, you can lose your language, but still shape the future. By 27 BCE, the traditional date marking the start of the Roman Empire under Augustus' Etruscan political identity was gone. Rome stood dominant, but beneath Rome's polished marble was an older layer. Hilltop cities, bronze mirrors, painted tombs, diviners studying lightning patterns. The Etruscans didn't vanish into silence. They blended into the loudest empire of the ancient Mediterranean, which might be the most subtle kind of endurance. And as we leave the painted tombs of Tarquinia behind, we carry this thought. Sometimes the forgotten are not erased. They are embedded, invisible, but foundational. And if you listen closely beneath Rome's triumphs, you might still hear the echo of Etruscan ritual, quiet, precise, and deeply woven into history. From the rolling hills of Italy, we now leap across the Atlantic to the tropical lowlands of what is today Mexico. Welcome to Mesoamerica. Welcome to the Olmecs. If the Etruscans gave Rome its rituals and style, the Olmecs gave Mesoamerica its first blueprint for complex civilization, and they did it with jaw-dropping flair. Around 1500 BCE, scattered villages along the Gulf Coast began to organize into ceremonial centers. Leventa was one of the most important. San Lorenzo and Tres Zapotes were others. But Leventa, with its massive platform mounds, earthen pyramids, and the world-famous colossal stone heads, captures the imagination. Those heads, oh the heads, they are enormous. Up to 3 meters tall, carved from single basalt boulders, sometimes transported dozens of kilometers. Each one bears a unique expression. Broad faces, helmet-like headgear, eyes that seem to stare through time. It's hard not to smile thinking about it. Someone, a community, spent months, maybe years, dragging these massive stones, carving, polishing, and erecting them, all for memory, power, identity. No horses, no wheels, just human ingenuity, and probably a lot of sweat, which tells you something. Olmec society was organized, very organized. Their heads probably represent rulers, warriors, or revered ancestors, but they weren't just decorative. They symbolized authority, cosmology, and the presence of power in public spaces. Think of it as propaganda on a grand scale, but in stone. And Leventa wasn't just about heads. Platform mounds were constructed over centuries, some aligned along north-south or east-west axes, perhaps tracking celestial movements or seasonal cycles. Others contained tombs, caches of jade figurines, and offerings of greenstone and obsidian. Yes, jade, because nothing says this is important like greenstone transported from distant mountains. Obsidian, volcanic glass, had to come from elsewhere. These materials were precious, rare, and highly symbolic. So the Olmecs weren't just sculptors, they were logisticians, traders, coordinators of people and resources. Which brings us to religion. Olmec religion is one of the most fascinating aspects of their civilization, and also mysterious. They worshipped jaguar deities, sometimes blending human and feline features. The jaguar was a symbol of power, fertility, and the otherworldly. Some scholars suggest the jaguar represented shamans themselves, transforming between human and spirit forms. That might sound mystical because it was religion, politics, and social hierarchy were tightly intertwined. Artistic motifs repeated across stone carvings, pottery, and figurines, showing continuity and shared belief. The Olmecs were creating a cultural language long before written records appeared. Speaking of writing, there's evidence that they experimented with early forms of glyphs. Some symbols appear on monuments at San Lorenzo and Leventa. Whether these were true writing systems or proto-writing, a visual shorthand for ideas and events, remains debated. Either way, the Olmecs were laying groundwork. Mesoamerica's later scripts, from the Maya to the Zapotecs, would echo these early attempts. So let's talk daily life. The Olmecs were farmers, first and foremost. They relied heavily on maize, beans, squash, and chili peppers. But Leventa and other centers show evidence of elite-controlled trade networks. Seashells from the Gulf of Mexico, obsidian from volcanic highlands, jade from distant regions, all suggest organized exchange and hierarchy. In other words, they were sophisticated, not just giant heads and pyramids. They knew how to feed people, move resources, and maintain social order. And here's something fun. Evidence from Leventa suggests ritual sacrifice, sometimes of humans. Children and adults appear in caches beneath mounds. It's sobering, yes, but it shows how seriously they approached the intersection of religion and politics. Monumental architecture, ritual centers, elite art, early writing. The Olmecs had many hallmarks of a civilization, and yet their political centers weren't empires in the sense of Hattusa or Kush. They were more like networks of influence, cultural hegemony rather than territorial dominance. Communities followed similar religious and social models, which spread the Olmec template across Mesoamerica. Now, like many early civilizations, the Olmec timeline has an enigmatic end. Around 400 BCE, Leventa and San Lorenzo declined. The reasons are not fully known. Environmental shifts, river course changes, soil depletion, or social upheaval may have played a role, but disappearance didn't mean events. Later, Mesoamerican civilizations, the Maya, the Zapotecs, the Mixtecs, even the Aztecs inherited many Olmec concepts. monumental stone sculpture, ball courts, religious iconography, ritual sacrifice, and possibly writing and calendrical systems. The Olmecs were the quiet but massive undercurrent of Mesoamerican culture, like an artist who doesn't sign their work, but whose style is unmistakable centuries later. Let's step back. Why do the Olmecs matter in our narrative of forgotten civilizations? Because they exemplify influence without empire. They weren't massive territorial conquerors like the Hittites. They weren't kings or pharaohs ruling from monumental palaces. Their power was cultural, spiritual, architectural, artistic, and yet it shaped the future. Standing at La Venta today, amid the flattened mounds and scattered basalt heads, it's almost impossible to imagine the human effort that went into these projects. Each stone carved, each mound raised, each jade figurine deposited. That's centuries of labor, coordination, and ritual investment. And in the humid Gulf Coast sun, you sense the Olmecs were not just surviving. They were experimenting, they were imagining, they were codifying belief systems that would echo for a millennium. Even the colossal heads convey a sense of personality. Each face seems individualized. They aren't generic representations. They hint at distinct rulers or figures of authority, personalities carved in stone for eternity. And perhaps that's the real genius of the Olmecs. They created permanence in a world where cities can erode, dynasties can fall, and rivers can change course. Civilizations vanish in different ways. Norte Chico faded quietly into the Andes. Hattusa burned in the chaos of the Bronze Age collapse. Urartu slowly yielded to emerging empires in the highlands. Kush shifted south, leaving pyramids and script as legacy. Etruscans were absorbed into Rome, and the Olmecs, they left a blueprint, a whisper of cultural DNA that persisted long after their ceremonial centers were abandoned. They remind us that power is not always loud or territorial. Sometimes it is expressive, symbolic, structural. When the sun sets over La Venta today, light falls across mounds that once rang with ceremonies, the hum of musicians and the voices of priests. The colossal heads watch silently, and even though the Olmecs disappeared as a dominant culture by 400 BCE, their vision endures in every Mesoamerican civilization that followed. They are a civilization that whispers, not shouts. And yet, when you listen carefully, it's clear their ideas were louder than stone. Human ingenuity, ritual, and artistry. Sometimes those last longer than kings, empires, and armies. And that is the legacy of the Olmecs, a culture that invented a world quietly, and whose echoes still resonate 5,000 years later. After the Olmecs, we move across the Pacific into the warm, humid archipelagos of Southeast Asia. Here, in the lush islands of what is now Indonesia, a maritime empire rose, not by conquering vast lands inland, but by mastering the seas. Welcome to the Srivijaya Empire. Around 650 CE, on the island of Sumatra, Srivijaya began consolidating power along the strategic waterways of the Malay archipelago, and it didn't take long to dominate. By controlling the Strait of Malacca, the choke point of maritime trade between India and China, Srivijaya became the preeminent trading power of Southeast Asia. Think about it. You don't need walls or massive land armies to be powerful if everyone passing through your region has to respect your authority. Ships laden with spices, gold, silks, ceramics, and other luxuries passed through Srivijaya's ports. Control of trade meant wealth. Wealth meant influence. Influence meant culture and politics radiating across islands and peninsulas. The empire was remarkably sophisticated. It was essentially a network of ports and coastal cities linked by waterways rather than a contiguous landmass, and yet it functioned like a unified state. Religion was central. Srivijaya became a hub of Mahayana Buddhism. Monks traveled from India, China, and other parts of Southeast Asia. Buddhist scholarship flourished. Palembang became a center of learning, meditation, and monastic life. The empire sponsored the construction of temples, stupas, and monasteries, some of which still survive as ruins or relics. Artifacts like votive statues, inscribed stones, and ritual objects attest to the empire's spiritual sophistication. But Srivijaya's genius was not just religious, it was economic. By the 9th century CE, the empire had established a network of tributary states and alliances across Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and the Malay Peninsula. These were semi-independent polities that paid tribute and recognized Srivijaya's authority. In exchange, they benefited from protection, trade access, and shared knowledge. And Srivijaya had a formidable navy. Ships patrolled the seas, safeguarding trade routes and enforcing influence. In an era when piracy could cripple commerce, maritime security was essential. Srivijaya's economy was also based on agriculture and resource management. They controlled fertile river valleys and harvested forest products like resins, spices, and hardwoods. These commodities fed the trade network and ensured that wealth flowed both outward and inward. Yet, despite its strength, Srivijaya was not invincible. For centuries, the empire navigated shifting alliances, foreign interventions, and internal power struggles. Powerful rivals arose in Java, Sumatra, and elsewhere. Temples and ports were sometimes destroyed by conflict, rebuilt, and expanded again. The empire was remarkably resilient, surviving for over 7 centuries. But by the 14th century, pressures mounted. Environmental changes, shifting trade patterns, and the rise of competing powers, like the Majapahit Empire in Java, challenged Srivijaya's dominance. Gradually, it lost control of key ports and tributaries. By 1377 CE, Srivijaya had effectively disappeared from the political stage. Its cities were abandoned or absorbed into other states. Palembang, once the bustling heart of maritime Southeast Asia, became a quieter regional town. But disappearance does not mean erasure. The legacy of Srivijaya persists in many ways. The spread of Buddhism in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand traces directly to its influence. Maritime trade networks established by Srivijaya became the foundation for later regional economies, and cultural practices, from temple architecture to ritual art, bear traces of its refinement. Srivijaya reminds us of a different kind of power. Unlike empires like Urartu or Kush, which relied on land-based fortresses, rivers, and armies, Srivijaya thrived by understanding and controlling movement, specifically maritime movement. The ocean was not a barrier, it was infrastructure. Trade routes were lifelines, and mastery of those routes allowed Srivijaya to punch above its weight politically and culturally. This is a subtle type of dominance. It doesn't always leave dramatic stone ruins or colossal heads. Instead, it leaves networks, artifacts, and cultural continuity. Walking through Palembang today, modern life covers the old port, but beneath the surface, the layout of the rivers, remnants of old docks, and scattered artifacts remind us that this was once a hub connecting continents. Srivijaya also teaches about adaptability. Controlling islands and waterways requires flexibility. Leaders negotiated with distant powers, managed tributary states, and balanced trade and religion to maintain cohesion. The empire's decline illustrates another pattern we've seen with other civilizations. Even a powerful, wealthy, and strategically positioned state can fall when broader systemic forces change. In Srivijaya's case, shifting trade routes, the rise of rivals, and internal fragmentation were enough to dismantle centuries of accumulated authority. And yet, unlike some empires that vanish in a blaze of war, Srivijaya faded gradually. Its cultural and religious influence persisted, quietly embedding itself in the fabric of Southeast Asia. It's a reminder that power can leave multiple types of marks: tangible structures, like temples and fortresses; economic networks, like trade routes and markets; intellectual and spiritual influence, like Buddhism and scholarship. Srivijaya excelled at all three. From a historical perspective, it also highlights the importance of geography in shaping civilizations, where Urartu leveraged mountains, Kush leveraged the Nile, the Hittites leveraged fertile plains and trade corridors. Srivijaya leveraged the sea, different environments, different strategies, but the principle is consistent. Mastery of local resources and movement is central to survival and influence. In the end, Srivijaya's story is both dramatic and contemplative. It was a kingdom of sailors, monks, merchants, and artisans. They controlled the flow of wealth across islands and seas. They nurtured culture, religion, and scholarship, and when their empire faded, it did so not in a violent collapse, but in a slow, graceful transition. The ruins at Palembang, the scattered temple foundations, the traces of old canals and docks, all whispered the story of a maritime empire that shaped an entire region for centuries. Srivijaya may no longer control the straits. Its kings and fleets are long gone, but the network they built, the ideas they spread, and the cultural foundations they laid survived long after the last ship set sail. It's the quiet power of influence. Civilizations can vanish politically, cities can be abandoned, temples can crumble, but ideas, trade networks, and culture often outlast rulers. Srivijaya reminds us that history is not just the story of kings, armies, and conquests. Sometimes it's the story of movement, adaptation, and subtle control of a kingdom that ruled not just lands, but the sea itself. And that is why the memory of Srivijaya endures as a silent, guiding current beneath the waves of Southeast Asia's history. Even in quiet rivers and long-forgotten ports, the empire's legacy flows on. From the tropical islands of Southeast Asia, we crossed the Pacific and moved north to the floodplains of the Mississippi River. Here, long before Europeans arrived, a civilization flourished in North America, a civilization defined not by stone pyramids or written scripts, but by earth, timber, and human organization. Welcome to the Mississippian culture. Around 800 CE, communities along rivers from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes began constructing large earthen mounds, but these were not small hillocks. Some were massive platform mounds, rising 30 meters high, with bases covering several hectares. The largest city was Cahokia, near modern St. Louis. At its peak around 1050 to 1200 CE, Cahokia may have had 10,000 to 20,000 inhabitants. That's larger than many European cities of the same period. Cahokia's Monk's Mound dominates the landscape, a flat-topped pyramid of earth, built layer by layer over generations. Imagine hundreds of people moving soil with baskets, coordinating labor without modern tools. It's monumental, and it's entirely human-scale ingenuity. The mounds served multiple purposes. Some were ceremonial platforms for temples, residences of elite leaders, or council spaces. Others were burial mounds, holding leaders and objects meant to accompany them into the afterlife. Society was hierarchical. Chiefs governed from atop the largest mounds, orchestrating ceremonies, trade, and labor, but they were supported by skilled artisans, farmers, and laborers, a complex network of interdependent roles. Agriculture underpinned it all. Maize, beans, and squash, the three sisters, formed the dietary backbone. Intensive farming allowed population growth, social stratification, and specialization. Trade connected Cahokia to distant regions. Shells from the Gulf Coast, copper from the Great Lakes, mica from the Appalachians, all flowed along rivers and trails. This trade network not only supplied materials, but also reinforced political and social influence across the region. Religion and ritual were central. Ceremonial plazas, alignments of mounds with celestial events, and iconography carved on stone, wood, and shell show a sophisticated cosmology. Some scholars suggest that the Mississippian worldview linked earthly and spiritual realms through sacred centers like Cahokia ball courts, similar in function to later Mesoamerican courts, hint at ritualized games with political and religious significance. These games reinforced social cohesion and reflected cosmic order. But the Mississippian story also carries caution. By 1350 CE, Cahokia began to decline. The causes are still debated: environmental degradation, resource depletion, flooding, social unrest, or disease, probably a combination. By the time Europeans arrived in North America, Cahokia was largely abandoned. Many smaller Mississippian centers continued for a while, but the civilization's urban peak had passed. And yet, like the Olmecs or Kush, disappearance did not mean erasure. Mississippian culture left an indelible mark across eastern North America. Their mound-building techniques, social organization, and trade networks influenced later indigenous societies, including the Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Creek peoples. Standing atop Monk's Mound today, you can see the Mississippi floodplain stretching for miles. The scale of human effort is humbling. A civilization built entirely from earth, sweat, and coordination, rather than stone or metal, dominates the landscape. The Mississippians remind us that monumental architecture doesn't require marble or basalt. Social complexity doesn't require writing. Influence doesn't require empire in the traditional sense. Civilizations rise in many forms. Some carve stone heads, some build pyramids of sand, some manipulate rivers and trade routes, and some, like Cahokia, raise the earth itself into symbolic, functional, and enduring structures. Cahokia also illustrates the fragile balance between human ingenuity and environment. Large populations, intensive agriculture, and deforestation likely stressed local ecosystems. Sustainability was never guaranteed, and history has its own way of reminding us that no system is permanent. Yet, despite decline, the Mississippian culture survives in memory and influence. The earthworks still stand. Archaeology preserves stories. Modern indigenous peoples carry cultural echoes of those ancient societies. Their legacy is subtle but profound. Civilizations do not need to dominate continents to leave lasting marks. They shape landscapes, rivers, and cultural memory. They teach lessons about organization, ingenuity, adaptation, and limits. Cahokia, the mounds, the plazas, the artifacts. They remind us that even when political or urban centers vanish, human achievement persists. Unlike the other civilizations we've explored, Urato, Kush, Olmecs, Srivijaya, the Mississippian culture shows that influence and endurance come in multiple forms: stone, earth, trade, ritual, writing, water. Civilizations are flexible. They rise, they adapt, and sometimes they fade quietly, but they leave traces, and those traces carry lessons about human creativity, ambition, and the humility of time. The Mississippians built their world from the soil beneath their feet, and centuries later, standing atop their mounds, you feel the weight of that effort, the order, the planning, the hope for continuity. Civilizations may crumble, rivers may change course, and forests may reclaim towns. But human ingenuity, expressed in earth, stone, water, or ritual, endures. And that is the lasting impression of the Mississippians, an empire that rose from the soil, ruled the rivers, and shaped history quietly, leaving echoes still visible in North America's landscapes today. After the earthen mounds of Cahokia, we travel across mountains, deserts, and steps into the vast expanse of Central Asia. Here, along the arteries of the Silk Road, the Sogdians flourished, not as conquerors, but as intermediaries, traders, and cultural brokers. Sogdiana stretched across what is now Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and parts of Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. Its most famous city was Samarkand, though Bukhara and Panjshir were also key hubs. Unlike empires defined by armies and borders, the Sogdians thrived through commerce and connection. They built no vast pyramids, they conquered few lands, but their influence traveled thousands of kilometers along trade routes, linking China, India, Persia, and the Mediterranean. Think about that for a moment. A civilization whose power was measured not by territory, but by the flow of goods, ideas, and people across continents. Silk, spices, gems, metalwork, horses, everything moved through Sogdian hands. And with goods came knowledge, languages, religions, technologies, and art. The Sogdians spoke an Eastern Iranian language, and they were multilingual. Traders had to negotiate with Persians, Indians, Chinese, Turks, and Arabs. Communication was survival. Diplomacy was profit. But it wasn't just about money. Sogdian merchants carried ideas: Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism, and later Islam spread along these trade routes. Artistic motifs traveled, influencing frescoes in Dunhuang, manuscripts in Persia, and pottery across Central Asia. In a way, the Sogdians were the connective tissue of Eurasia. Their caravans linked deserts, mountains, and rivers, turning remote oases into nodes of cultural exchange. We see evidence in art. Vivid murals from Panjshir depict Sogdian merchants in colorful robes, negotiating with foreign traders, carrying silk bales, or riding horses along desert tracks. The images tell us something crucial. They were proud of their role. Their identity was tied to movement, trade, and cross-cultural interaction. And yet Sogdiana was not a political empire in the traditional sense. Local rulers existed, but authority was fluid. Traders often had more influence than kings. Economic networks mattered more than military conquest. Their urban centers were planned with sophistication. Samarkand, for example, had residential districts, markets, temples, and caravanserais, safe resting places for merchants and animals traveling long distances. It was both a city and a node in a continental network. But Sogdian prosperity relied on adaptability. The Silk Road is not kind. Harsh deserts, high mountains, and seasonal rivers demanded logistical mastery. Caravans required coordination, protection, and knowledge of terrain. Survival depended on timing, relationships, and careful planning, and they weren't always secure. Nomadic incursions, rival merchants, or shifting empires could disrupt trade. Yet the Sogdians endured for centuries, adjusting to new political realities while maintaining economic dominance. Their peak influence spans roughly from 500 BCE to 1000 CE, but by the 10th century, their independence waned. Conquerors like the Arabs, Turks, and later Mongols reshaped the region. Cities fell under new rulers, and Sogdian political autonomy faded. But here's the striking part. Even as political power disappeared, Sogdian cultural and economic influence persisted. Their merchants, artisans, and knowledge networks left an enduring legacy across Eurasia. Artistic motifs, coinage, and temple designs influenced cultures as far as China and Iran. And linguistically, the Sogdian language survived in religious and commercial contexts well into the first millennium CE. What makes the Sogdians fascinating is their mode of endurance. They show us that civilizations do not need armies or monumental architecture to be powerful. Influence can travel in subtler ways, through goods, ideas, and human networks. Standing today in Samarkand, among the ruins of ancient fortifications and caravanserais, it's easy to imagine bustling markets filled with silk, spices, and chatter in dozens of languages. Caravans wind across the desert, stopping at oasis cities where Sogdian merchants negotiate deals, arrange transport, and transmit knowledge. It's a civilization defined by movement rather than stasis, influence rather than dominion, connection rather than conquest. The Sogdians remind us that power can be portable, culture can be fluid, and civilizations can leave legacies that are intangible, woven into the fabric of trade, art, and cross-cultural exchange. Even when empires fall, roads remain. Ideas travel. Names may fade, but influence endures. By 1000 CE, political Sogdiana had been absorbed into larger empires. Yet the essence of the Sogdians, their networks, their economic acumen, and their cultural adaptability had already spread widely. And that is the quiet genius of the Sogdians, a civilization that shaped continents, not through armies or walls, but through the hum of commerce, the rhythm of caravans, and the careful negotiation of trust and knowledge across deserts and mountains. They remind us that history is multidimensional. Civilizations rise not only with monuments or dynasties, but also through connection, movement, and ideas, the intangible highways that outlast stone and steel. The Sogdian cities may crumble, their palaces may vanish, and their language may fade, but the routes they mapped, the commerce they enabled, and the culture they transmitted continue to echo across Eurasia. Power is not always loud. Sometimes it flows silently along the Silk Road, in the footsteps of merchants, in the trade of silk and spices, and in the exchange of ideas that shape civilizations long after the kings are gone. And that is Sogdiana's enduring mark, a civilization woven into the continent itself, quietly, invisibly, and just like that, we've stepped into worlds that once pulsed with life, cities filled with merchants, builders, priests, rulers, families now reduced to ruins, earth, and silence. From the towering stone walls of Great Zimbabwe, to the vast earthen mounds of Cahokia, to the rose-red cliffs guarding Petra, and the remarkably ancient city of Caral, these weren't minor civilizations. They were powerful, innovative, and deeply human. And yet, many of their stories were left out of the history lessons we grew up with. That's what makes exploring lost civilizations so fascinating. They remind us that history is far bigger, richer, and more complex than we're often told. If you enjoyed uncovering these forgotten worlds, please like this video. It truly helps the channel grow and allows us to keep bringing hidden history to light. I'd love to hear from you. Which lost civilization should we explore next? Is there one you think deserves more attention? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an expedition into the mysteries of the past. When you're ready to continue the journey, Check out the related videos on your screen. There are more untold stories, ancient enigmas, and forgotten empires waiting for you. Until next time, remember, even when civilizations fade, their stories are never truly lost, as long as we're willing to rediscover them.